Ladies and gentlemen of the press, thank you for coming to this very brief coffee roundtable with the governor, who is meeting the media for the first time.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. It's a really beautiful day in Montserrat for those who are able to see it. What a lovely view we have from the balcony here. So I'm a very happy governor in my 8th or 9th week, I think, here in Montserrat, on a beautiful day like this with clouds scudding about over the sea. It's a very, very happy and comfortable place to live and work. So, gents and ladies of the press, if you would like to ask me any questions at all, please feel totally free. I'll look forward to a chat together for the next 30 or 40 minutes over some coffee and biscuits. Far away.
Good morning, Governor. Narissa Golden from Discover Montserrat. In your opening speech at your ceremony, you mentioned several things that you wanted to accomplish while you were here. 9 weeks in, are those things still viable, or have you seen other things that you would like to add to that list?
That's a very good question. I think the answer is that they are still viable, but probably in frankness there's quite a lot more that have been added into the pot in that 9 weeks. But no, they are very much still key and at the top of my radar screen.
Okay. Tell us what those additional things are.
Well, I think I've been struck here by the sheer complexity of life for a small island and a small community. It's one thing to be briefed on these things back in London, and some fascinating insights by colleagues, British and Montserratian colleagues back in the UK, but you don't feel it in the same way until you're actually here. You don't feel it in the same way until you find that you can't get a ferry for 3 or 4 days at a time because some strange swellmageddon has arisen, and it's arisen right at the time that the island is trying to pull in the rest of the world community to enjoy St. Patrick's Day together. You feel those things much more when you're here with your own family and you're exposed in a way to the same problems and challenges. It's much more real. So I think the short answer to that question is it's the depth and the intractability, actually, of some of the challenges that's been brought home to me in the last 9 weeks. Yeah.
Your Excellency, James White from Radio Montserrat.
Hi,
you mentioned about the whole access issue, and you quite rightly spelt out some of the challenges that we face in that particular area. Your predecessor tried her best as well to get that moving. Now you are in that position. What can we expect from you in terms of, I know that we've been talking a lot about putting a breakwater in place, and I'm going to throw this little one in as well, to put proper contingencies in place. We had some options, Winnie coming in and so on. And I always find, like from a disaster management background, that a contingency plan is necessary. You put all your options and you exercise them where possible. But what do you think that you can do from here on in terms of pushing forward the whole access issue?
No, thanks. That's a very good question. I mean, you have to be realistic. Each of us has to be realistic. Montserrat's been in this position for nearly 20 years, isn't it, since the volcanic eruption. Extremely difficult. We're on a tiny island. There are commercial realities. There isn't the free land space for the sort of airfield we'd all like, which means we can fly in on a big jet in the way you can to Antigua. So there's that necessary limit. And as far as the ferry is concerned, it's forced to operate from clearly a very constrained harbour. I'm no marine expert, but when you go down and look at that, and you see the impact of these strange swells, it wasn't just what they called swellmageddon, not just that one. I mean, this last weekend I was planning to shoot across to Antigua with my family for a bit of a break, and we'd booked ourselves on the ferry on Sunday morning, And even the mini Swellmageddon, it was called something else, I think, and it was bringing Egyptian dust with it. But whatever, it was Saharan dust or something, but whatever it was doing, you could see it had a significant impact on the water levels, the up and down, the swell at the jetty. So we thought, right, we better try and rebook on a flight, and we were lucky we were able to. So you can sort of feel the extent of the challenge, and no one person, no group of people can come and fundamentally overcome nature. Nature is the way it is here. It's blessed Montserrat with beauty and a degree of isolation, which is part of the charm, but it's also created some challenges. So you have to be realistic about that. But a sort of short practical answer to the question is, from what I can see, the main mechanism for bringing people in numbers comfortably to Montserrat is the ferry. Flight is great for those who can afford the costs, which are quite high for us all. But the length of the airfield and those sort of constraints, topographical constraints, mean it's not bulk passenger route. So it's the ferry that's the key for sort of bulk numbers. And all the while we've got that small jetty, I don't know when it dates back to, but that small jetty there, with these issues of the swell coming around the bluff and having the impact it does on the jetty, there's got to be a breakwater. I think we all recognise that. So the issue of the breakwater is not my personal area of direct authority as governor, as you know, but to the extent that I can help advise and support and facilitate, I do believe that a breakwater is key. Breakwater, getting that in place will make a huge difference to the quality of life for Montserratians. There is a debate about exactly where to position it, the scale of it, all those things, a legitimate debate, and that's been gone over in detail. And the Premier is rightly, I know, very focused on the need to get that right as we can. For me, making a decision soon on the breakwater, getting the thing rolling, is key.
Bennett Roach, Your Excellency, we've met a couple of times.
Yes.
One under not so pleasant conditions, but the other time more pleasant conditions. You come from a different background, if you like. Our last two governors, and I'm just doing this as a background situation to my question. The last two governors were DFID-oriented. And in fact, they came in at the time too when it was a clear decision that DFID would work more closely with FCO. I remember running into problems with one FCO person who came in, and when I was challenging that, well, we knew that for years, DFID and FCO did not even speak to one another, 20 years ago, or a little less than that. But so they came in, the DFID office even joined with the governor's office and operated out of the governor's office. But these two governors were mostly DFID oriented. And it was the first thing I noticed when the announcement was made that you were coming from an FCO background. I used to always be asking questions about the FCO's role, the governor's role in really looking after civil society in Montserrat. And I have to say, I abandoned the questions because the governors could not deal with it. I believe that you, coming from your background, would be much more able to deal with that. And it is something that I am expecting that you will certainly pay some attention to. And I'll give you an example of which is a little, not quite the same thing, but for example, there used to be what we call the Human Rights Reporting Committee. Human Rights Reporting Committee, HRRC, I think it was. I don't know where that has disappeared to, because we are supposed to fill out these several forms and send them up to Britain, which forms part of their report, the UK's report to United Nations or whatever. And I don't know where that has gone. And that used to deal with issues naturally of the whole community. We don't seem to have that anymore. I don't know what has happened to it. And so I'm looking forward to you to sort of bring things like this back to life and to really pay more attention to the community. I know that from the prison point of view, from the police point of view, that's where your authority, you have some authority in those areas. But then the community itself has been sort of left void. And I also know that it is the FCO's responsibility if it does the funding for civil society operations altogether. So I'm hoping that that's something you'll bring to us. So if you can give us your commitment.
Absolutely. No, those are very, very good points indeed. A number of really good points you make there. You certainly have my commitment. I can't promise there's any easy or fast answers. There aren't. I think we all know that. But you certainly have my commitment. As far as FCO, DFID, well, all of us really, whether it's the ministries in the UK that deal with things like aviation security or safety, you know, the bottom line is we all have our part in a modern world, I think. And from what I've seen in some other past jobs in the Foreign Office, you always have problems when two ministries or two groups are opposed to each other, don't trust each other, have a different agenda. You always have a problem. And the net result is always bad for everybody. The sort of fighting energy takes up any good energy, so it doesn't move things forward for people. I've seen that very clearly in certain previous roles. So I think I mentioned in my swearing-in speech that for me partnership was absolutely key, and it is a bit of one of these cliches. People say, oh, we'll all be partners together, it'll be great, we're all natural partners. It is a bit of sort of diplomatic blah, 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 to be frank about that. The trick is to make it not blah, 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 but to really mean it, to really think it. So when issues arise, we don't deal with them in a little pocket and keep that information secret to ourselves and think we can score points over another player. We bring them together and we air the issues openly. That is my style, and that's what I've already really tried to begin to do in the Governor's office, is to make sure that every problem that arises, whether it's issues surrounding the new police vessel coming hopefully soon, or breakwater, or access, or whatever those issues, that we really genuinely tackle them together and don't shirk the difficult questions. There are lots of difficult questions, and some of them, you know, maybe they don't reflect so well on our individual ministries' past performance or the Montserrat government's past performance in some ways. That's the history, that's the reality. Let's not shirk that. Let's take that and let's do the best we can. So that's perhaps a slightly long-winded answer to you, but you certainly have my commitment. Partnership with me means what it says on the can. It really does. It's not just a mantra. It means copying people into everything. It means bringing people into meetings, and it means bringing out the issues and solving them, not pushing them off or playing email ping pong with each other. I really mean those things. That's not always comfortable for some, but it's going to be my watchword and my approach as Governor. Well, just on the issue there of DFID and FCO, partnership is absolutely key. And to be fair to everybody, from what I've always seen in the whole British realm, if I can put it that way, wherever I've encountered it, there are problems, there are differences of view, but we have to recognise that everyone comes at it from in good faith. You know, DFID will sometimes have a different, I'm not speaking for them directly, but DFID will sometimes have a different perspective. They have a responsibility to deliver development aid in a way that meets the requirements of the Development Act, and their detailed and expert understanding of that means they have to have certain requirements that go with it. The Foreign Office doesn't have the same expert knowledge and depth in that particular field, but the Foreign Office brings a greater breadth in some respects because of a greater breadth of responsibility for the overseas territories. And those two need to come together and support each other and recognise each other and not be negative towards each other. And the Montserrat government plays a part in it as well. I mean, that third pillar is also very important. The Montserrat government has to recognise that there are responsibilities as well as obligations on the part of the UK government, and it's when they come together that we get the best mix. Easy to say, hard to deliver, but that's the sort of watchword, I think.
On the right towards the end, and in fact I was going to ask you about it before, or speak to it before, but you did make sure that you brought in the fact that Montserrat government has a has its share of responsibilities, and you mentioned the word obligations. That has been the case in particularly so. Let's go back to, say, 2011 or 2012, even before, but certainly so. On the DFID FCO situation, they have come much closer together. They're much closer together. Like I said, the merger of the two offices basically was an indication of at least the beginning of that, or confirmation of that. So they have worked together, and even more than we had thought. That's been there. So you're coming into a good time as far as that is concerned. But on the Montserrat government obligations, it's something that I think you're quite right. I noticed you stressed it and you mentioned it more than once. I think that needs to be followed through. Is there any control that you have in terms of making sure that that happens, that we meet our obligations, or that would you be reminding them, look, we've got this obligation, we've got that obligation, and so on?
Well, it's one of these very British structures, isn't it? The way the overseas territories in general are sort of handled, the relationship. It dates back many decades, and it's a subtle balance, which at its best, I'm no expert, although I've always been fascinated by the overseas territories since a schoolboy. Watching the Falklands War unfold, to be honest, was my thing. But it's a fascinating and subtle construction that we've built together with the overseas territories, and at its best, it is great. At its best, it's one of these strange things. It's not sort of hugely detailed, precise, but it's the sort of slight ambiguity in it that has been its strength. So the sort of balance of powers, and I suppose one would also say that it has this strange thing that you never want to use the ultimate sanction that a country like Britain has of sort of imposing itself. That's, you've probably failed together, failed if you have to do that in some respects. So no one wants to do that. So it works best when there's a friendship and understanding, and it's simple. People talk together, and they talk about real things that matter, and they try to move them on in a practical way. That's when it works at its best. But this is a personal comment, so this is not a British government position.
Right.
But what is clear to me is that there's a real question about whether that formula is still fully fit for purpose, and that's something that in some places whether it's fully fit for purpose, and I think there's a genuine debate around that. It's not an immediate thing; it's a longer term thing, and the momentum from that obviously needs to come from, in this case, Montserratian colleagues themselves. It's their decision. But from what I see, I do think there's a case for some adjusting of the model at some stage. That's a personal view, as I say there. But the key with it is definitely its relationships. It's a common understanding and a common set of principles, rather than finger wagging or threatening or applying sanction type levers. That you've gone wrong when when you're in that territory.
I would just add one thing to the requirement that you're talking about. I would just say frankness. That is my personal observation over the years, that there's missing, and I'm not going to point my finger to one side or the other, but there's not, for me, enough openness and frankness in coming to the thing. I think if we can get the frankness in there, where people can talk about something frankly without feeling unloved, so I don't use the word hate, feeling unloved, or that you can disagree, but be frank about what I think that's what's missing, quite frankly, quite honestly, with what's been going on. To move on a bit, on the access situation, you see, yes, we need when we have these, and it's really twice a year now, when we have this bulk of people coming to Montserrat. But the thing is, we need, I think, the conversation to improve on the access situation. I do not honestly believe that the ferry is our future. Cannot be. I mean, the ferry really is taking us back. So, I mean, as far as in terms of the access to the island, and you mentioned, of course, terrain and all of that and so on, but I quite honestly would like to see my government bring back on the table the improvement of an airport, whether it's a new airport, improving the one we have or whatever it is, because we won't get away that the entire Caribbean talks about tourism as being one of its main, if not the main, thing with our GDP or whatever we call it. And to do that, you have to have the type of access that people would need to bring us to the island. So you had to resort on what might have been a normal day for Montserrat to using the aircraft. And you did mention the fact about it being expensive and so on. I don't know if it has to be that way. I think I know differently because of where I come from in that setting, my involvement in that setting earlier, 10 years ago. 10 years ago. But that's something I'd love to see come on the table. It was there, and I don't know if James would like to add something to that with me on the whole access issue, as to whether the ferry is really the answer for us going forward. What do you think, Nerissa? What do you want to say?
I don't think that we should be sitting around the table having that discussion. It has to come back to, we need to look at the data and see what's really necessary. It has been the most efficient way for us to get people here because we don't have an alternative. But I think it's all part of the big conversation we need to be having about where we're going to put our investment and our time and our resources. And I don't think Montserrat's figured out yet what we want to do, where we want to go, and how we're going to do that. Because we are not having that conversation. So I suppose my next question to you, Governor, would be one of the things that we've had over the years when we have these meetings with the governor in office is that position of, oh, this is a government of Montserrat thing, it's not the governor's office thing. And there's been, I don't know if you recognize it yet, but there's been a lack of information coming from the government side. They have tried to improve it, but in terms of communicating with our leader of government, that's very hard for the local press. How do you see, what's the importance for you of the media in how government functions, and what do you think you can do about helping to improve that here?
Well, thanks. Those are very good questions. I mean, I can't really comment on, how Montserratian government colleagues handle the media. That's not really for me to say, and I don't have the background and depth of experience here to be able to make a sensible comment anyway. What I do know is that in my own meetings with Montserrat government colleagues, ministers and permanent secretaries and others, that what I'm very struck by is how they really do care. They really care about Montserrat and really love Montserrat, and it really pains them visibly when things go wrong or when there are pressures and challenges, and that I find really very encouraging. And I don't mean that in a patronizing way, but when people visibly care, things will sometimes go wrong for all of us. They do. Any big organizations have problems, but if people really care and are really trying their best, there's always hope, to put it at its simplest. So I think it's a question of getting those things across, those inner drives across to members of the public who quite understandably won't necessarily be aware of all the complexities in government life that hold things up. We can't just simply sit around the table together, draw money out of a pot and decide who we're going to award a contract to build a new breakwater, for example. It doesn't work that way. It can't. There are a whole set of constraints and analyses that come into play, and as our brief conversation here about the complexities of access show, it's a complicated business here. How do you extend a runway where there's a big cliff-like drop at each end? And if you can't extend it, how do you reduce the price when you're operating with tiny, very aging aircraft, and when actually the customer data show that there isn't yet the demand to support bigger flights? These are complicated things, and nobody has got a simple or easy answer. But it comes back, I think, to what colleagues were saying about frankness. In simple terms, I believe the media play a really important role. I've seen that in my own country and others where I've served. When things start to go off track a bit, the media are our collective ally in identifying those things, holding people to account, and focusing so that we can do something about it together. So the media is fundamentally a force for good, definitely. I've seen that very clearly. It's not always comfortable, for governments, for anybody under media scrutiny, but it's a really good challenge, and you refine your policies and thinking when you're challenged about them. So I'm an absolute supporter of it, and very, very keen to work with it. And I don't know whether there's been a gap here in the past or not. That's, as I say, it's not for me to say, but going forward on some of these critical issues for us, I hope we can have a good airing in the media in the honest, frank way that media colleagues here have just requested. I think that'll be better for us all. Yeah.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I was just listening to your endorsement of the media, and of course the importance of having the media, in terms of keeping that dialogue going and getting the information out. But I also support my colleagues by saying that we are still not certain where we really want to go in terms of access, and the dialogue must continue. And I heard Nerissa mention about analyzing the data as to what we really can glean from that data to see where we need to go. And I'm very much in support of that. But I want to take you to a topical issue. It's concerning the budget, the budget presentation. And there is concern that there might be a constitutional breach in terms of the stipulated time by which the presentation should be made. What have you been hearing along these lines, and what do you think if there is a constitutional breach or not?
No, it's a fair question. I'm not in a position to reach a view myself without legal advice on whether there is a constitutional breach in that or not. Haven't been able to see an Attorney General advice on that, for example, which clearly we need to be clear. So on that specific issue, I'm aware it's been raised, and clearly needs to be resolved and addressed. Clarity for the future, and it'll be an important matter for us to get right. But perhaps I just add a comment that I do know from discussions in the margins of Cabinet, and the presentation of the budget is obviously not a gubernatorial, it's not a governor's sort of area of direct responsibility. But I do know, again, coming back to my sort of fundamental point a bit earlier, is that the motivations for any delay are purely to get it right, to be in a position to give the best presentation, and in order to balance certain other work priorities. So whether or not it's fully constitutional, that's an important point. We must always follow our own constitution, clearly, but the drivers that are fundamentally behind it are honourable ones, in my view.
Okay. Let's also look, well, next year, elections are constitutionally due.
Yes.
Next year, and I know that there's been at least 2 appointments to the Electoral Commission, and I would anticipate that there would be other appointments to that commission. And we're looking now at the time for the completion of the reform process in time for the election next year.
Yes.
So could you just shed some light on that in terms of the other appointments, and is there a time limit for them to complete the reform process in time for the elections next year?
Well, I don't have a sort of fully detailed knowledge of that subject, to be frank, James, there, but as far as I understand it, there is 1 vacancy on the Electoral Reform Commission. It was agreed, endorsed by Cabinet last year before I was here, but to form a small commission to come up with recommendations. and to consult quite widely, including the Montserratian diaspora. And I think, I don't know quite why, but I think one vacancy's arisen for whatever reason. And I've, in discussion with the people concerned, I've asked that vacancy be filled soon as practicable. And I've asked for expressions of interest to be solicited first, so that rather than just, if you like, a group of the great and the good sit around and pick somebody. I'm sure they often will generally pick very good people, but in this instance I felt it was appropriate to make sure we put out a request for expressions of interest in the position very widely, because getting electoral reform right really does need that sort of diversity of input. Younger people, older people, expatriate Montserratians, the whole range, so we get a proper input and a perspective. I haven't set a deadline on that. It's probably not really for me to set a deadline in an instance of that sort of internal nature, but we have agreed to do that as quickly as possible, and as far as I'm aware that's underway, that process, so we should have a fully fledged, up and running, full complement of Electoral Reform Commission in place. And then I think the recommendation before the Cabinet endorsed was that the proposals should be ready by September, which I think gives us a year. That sounds reasonable. My only sort of it's a broad touch thing, broad brush thing, is that more generally in my career, and particularly perhaps here, I'm conscious that we have an awful lot of learned reviews. We produce vast papers, very complicated 50, 100-page consultancy papers, and then we review all the consultancies that stacked up over the last 10 years and have another review of that. And it's all well-intentioned, but it goes nowhere. And so what you need is to really simplify things, 1 or 2 pages of clear, precise actions and improvements that we can really move forward as a small community, not some magnificent structure that might work for a huge country like an America or something like that. We must bring it down to proportion and balance and action. And that is what I would want from this particular Electoral Reform Commission as well. With all respect, I think it's Mr. White who's the chair. He's an excellent colleague, I know, from a brief meeting, but I would really ask that we keep it simple and clear, precise choices that we can implement.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the latter, because some people seem to feel that what works for the larger countries, that it's applicable for us. There are times when we need to just take portions,
absolutely,
and fit it to our circumstance. This other question, I think it's a little ticklish one, as you.
It's a tricky one you got coming right.
It has to do with this this Chinese company that I think wants to embark on some development in the Woodlands area, and it's our understanding that a resident has written a letter claiming corruption and whatever concerning this company. Have you received that letter? I understood that they wrote to you. Have you received that letter?
Yeah, I have received a letter from a resident. It's actually in this area here, I think. Not precisely sure where, but very close to where we are now. Yes, I've received that letter. Sorry, you'd like me to elaborate a bit?
Yes,
yeah, okay.
yes.
Sorry. We've received that letter, and I mean, obviously, it's not for me as governor to get into detail of a particular investment proposal. That wouldn't be right here, particularly one on which Cabinet hasn't yet reached a firm view, partly because the proposals are at a very early and outline stage. And the resident who's written in is absolutely within his rights to write and express concern. That's absolutely the way governments should work, or relationships with government should be. And the minister responsible has been looking at the letter, and I think may have already replied, or if he hasn't already replied, is very close to ensuring a proper response goes. And the concerns written in the letter have been noted. The letter was to me, but I think copied to some others, but I've made sure that it's been copied round and is receiving appropriate consideration. More generally, I mean, just to sort of perhaps comment a little bit about investment. As I say, it's not for me. It's Montserratian colleagues. It's Montserratian Island. It's for Montserrat to decide what sort of economy it wants and where it's going in that. That's not right. Britain shouldn't come in, and I shouldn't, as governor, come in and try and impose some outside view or will on that. Certainly after just how many weeks it is, 8 weeks. But it's something like that. But what I would say, and this is perhaps a more personal perspective, is that when I look around a bit of the Caribbean and other places I've been, if I were a Montserratian, I would want to be careful about not giving too high a priority to mass tourism on the grounds that it would be a rapid and quick fix to the economy. The reason for that is that Montserrat is a beautiful and very charming and very special place, and an economic development strategy for it needs to reflect that subtlety. If you park an enormous 4,000 berth ocean cruiser somewhere off Little Bay or Cars Bay or some other bay, the impact of that sort of tourism on Montserrat would destroy it. It might bring you some money in the short term, but it would destroy what we have that's special. It really would. You know, that's my own view. It's for Montserrat to decide. If Montserrat wanted that, ultimately, then that's your free choice. But I don't think we should be looking at that mix myself here. I personally would recommend, from what I've seen, I hope this doesn't sound arrogant after 8 weeks, it's only just a personal view, but a more subtle blend that plays to the strengths here, plays to the uniqueness of it, plays to its rather peculiar sort of Britishness, if I can put it that way, and what goes with that, good and bad. And the volcano is unique. It's absolutely fascinating to fly over it or go around it. Dreadful that 19 of our friends lost their lives, but to look at Pompeii, modern Pompeii, is unique. It's absolutely an extraordinary thing. And to have a chance to look at the group, I think they're called Fourth Dimension, who have put together a sort of virtual reality pilot of what they could show us of life in Plymouth based on tales and stories and past pictures of Montserratians here. It's absolutely fascinating. Maybe I'm a bit of a nerd, but I thought it was absolutely fascinating to go back in history and see what a beautiful atmospheric place Plymouth was. So to play to that sort of interest, to play to the interest of people of my generation, for whom Air Studios represented probably the last century's very best and most sort of most memorable music, and the lifestyles that went with it. You know, the pictures of Sting relaxing on the streets or dancing over the kit in Air Studios. To bring that to life, not because it's a grotty old building now, which it is, there's nothing much to that, but it's the lifestyle, the atmospheric, the dynamic that went with it. Those things, for a certain group of people, would be, to put it bluntly, quite a big money spinner. I mean, that's a rather horrible way to put it, but they would be. And they would bring a particular style and volume of tourism here, with an element of sort of natural interest as well. I'm a great naturalist. And the Montserrat Oriole, your beautiful orchid, critically endangered, the Pribby, those sorts of things are fantastic. And they drive a particular type and quality of, let's put it frankly, high-end tourism in general. That to me is could be a real mainstay here. Coupled with something that's perhaps missed is that Montserrat has been unlucky in some ways, very unlucky, being hit by a thing, whatever it was, that hurricane, Hugo, and then the volcano. Very unlucky, but in another sense, we have a chance here, and Maria and Irma's sort of clipping of our tail tweaked that opportunity to make our island a sort of hurricane resilient and green island in the Caribbean. Build back better. Make sure we duct our electrical cables. Make sure we design our power systems in a way that beats hurricanes. Because if we don't, then every time we invest in anything here, always at the back of any investor's mind is the next 5 years, or the next 10, or the next 1, it's all gone again. But if we can set an example of building for the future, building in a resilient way, and coupling it with high-end and green type of tourism and economic added value, I think that could be a very, very special recipe for here.
I'm very glad that you elaborated along those lines, because one of the reasons why I actually asked the question, because we have not had much detail about the whole issue. But it's putting have security, safety and security juxtaposed with investment, and you mentioned tourism. And I just want us to really strike a balance between both the security aspect and the investment, and to ensure that we are not destroyed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely agree with you. Yeah.
Your Excellency, I would love to draw your attention and invite you to familiarize yourself with the 2012 Tourism Development Plan that was done, 2012. And it fits into very much what you're saying.
Does it?
Yes, so I will invite you to get it. I can immediately send you a copy before I leave here of it, and really look at it. I think if we really go back to working on that plan, we would be a long way away. Nerissa talked about the data and so on. And 2014, 15, the data that was provided at that time, it's gone, it's lost, because that was never brought forward. But that information would address and begin to address the situation. I listened to the then tourism director, we'd call her, and I don't know if it's because I'm a statistician in the past somewhere.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But it was like music listening to the presentation of that with regards to tourism going forward. That sort of information is there. And working along with that plan, I think really we can go places.
Oh, it's very interesting. I think probably if somebody did draw my attention to that, I confess I haven't read that particular one, but I would like to. I hope it's, and understand it, probably the essence of it is being reflected in the government's new, what do they call it, EGS, Economic Growth Strategy. So, but we must make sure that we don't lose the benefit of analysis like that. No, I absolutely agree with you. The other thing, perhaps is a bit of a personal foible, because I'm one of these Brits who loves spending his life in his garden. So does my family and my wife in particular. But I think, this is again a bit of a personal foible perhaps, but I feel we underestimate here in Montserrat the real benefit of growing things for ourselves, if I can put it bluntly. It's very hard as an island to move these strategies forward, whether it's the sort of strategy that you've been describing or in whichever field, if ultimately you have to import everything that you eat. You can't feed yourself, to put it to its bluntest. So you're buying a lot of stuff, some of which is perhaps, in the way of commercial realities, it's not the sort of highest quality kit or products, and often a bit close to its expiry date. It's just the way life is. I understand the drivers. And then we have to put a tax on it ourselves because we have to raise a revenue. Yeah. So it's very expensive for people, Montserratian families, to buy stuff which is not all that great for health. To put it bluntly, if we can grow more of our own, and it's not a massive sea change, this is clearly quite a tricky terrain, very mountainous in parts, but if we can do a bit of skillful terracing here and there, use some vertical greenhousing, which is a new technology I understand, greenhousing, not glass, but the green mesh screens, it's surprising what you can produce. And once we start to produce some things that feed ourselves with good quality fruit for our children and all of us in our families, you cut that sort of drain that drains your money, drains your resources for no benefit. And then you move a step beyond that, and the beautiful Montserratian limes that were once, world renowned, and they are really good, the flavour. I've pinched a few from trees. Or your lovely strawberry guavas.
Tell me where those trees are so I can pinch some.
You've pinched, I'll tell you. Or you try a fresh Montserratian strawberry guava in peak condition. There's no better fruit, packed with vitamin C. Those things, you can start selling those to, frankly, Antigua, where I've just been, or St. Kitts, where we're off next week for a conference. Places like that, perhaps particularly the more upmarket hotels. So not only do you feed yourself, you get a greater sense of independence. You cut the drain on our exchequer here in Montserrat, but you start to grow it. And for me, that's something that we've neglected a bit. It's not everyone's cup of tea, youngsters particularly, to go and dig a garden. It starts in a rather basic way, but once you've got the basics in place and you can see the sort of the benefits of it, you can move on and add some technology. To my mind, that together with the sort of high-end tourism product are a better future for Montserrat than some of the other options I've seen aired.
Yes, for me, Your Excellency, because I mean, what you're saying there is not really new.
No?
It's been here. It's been talked about.
Yeah.
I think attempts even have been made to have this whole green, what they call it, backyard gardening is what I think they concentrated
Yeah.
a few years ago. But it's probably just dropped by the wayside. As I was driving here, it's
Is
still
it?
going on. Well, there you go. So as I was driving here, I saw a greenhouse just up the road here, and I thought, I mean, and I know whose it is, and I remembered that particular person saying to me that, and it's a she, does her own vegetables and so on.
Yeah.
I said, how come you must sell me some, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there are people who have that understanding and that knowledge, and I believe what I think is lacking, Your Excellency, is, so we are sitting here having this conversation, and it's how this conversation is garnered, how is it put together, who sits where and who does what, in order to inform the strategies and whatever it is that the various ministries develop. As I came here this morning, prepared to come here, I thought about, we haven't heard a word about where we're going with the geothermal thing. We haven't had anything since we met some months now, at least 2 months now. We don't know what's happening. We haven't heard anything about where that is going. And along with that, the whole energy, the whole energy discussion, we don't hear anything. So we do not know who's driving that kind of thing. And I will say this, as I remember saying to your predecessor, if all we're doing is sitting down and waiting for the public servants to inform and guide those things, we are not going to get any place. And I mean, she agreed in one instance where she said there is more beneficial information outside of. But every committee they make, it's locked in with the public. And I think that's where we need to somehow take that out. And it's my suggestion, I'm mentioning it to you again, to draw in this conversation which is happening with you today, but it can go on outside, involving people from inside, so that we all get it.
I agree absolutely with what you say. It's so easy to spend all your life talking and writing papers, and it's the nature of government that we tend to do that, don't we? We're not, in general, entrepreneurial. I think a couple of good individuals or groups who get together and start something are a fantastic catalyst. Fantastic catalyst. Somebody who just does something that people drive past and think, right, that's it, I can see all those tomatoes bursting out of there. Or that lady has started a hydroponics operation, and goodness me, or someone's got a fish farm up and running, and every Friday everyone in Montserrat can go and get a really nice piece of fish that's Montserratian fish and feed their children on that high protein, low fat, brilliant diet that fish represent. It needs somebody to just get up and do it, to start coin the phrase, and government's job is to help catalyse that.
Correct.
And absolutely has my support. But bearing in mind the constitutional limits on my role, which clearly I shouldn't be intervening and pushing and driving things which are fundamentally for the Montserratian part, if I could put it that way, of our government here. And the internal economic activity is fundamentally for Montserrat itself to decide. But the extent to which I can help catalyse and support that, I absolutely will. I really agree with what you say. And in government, let's be honest, government servants, they're humans, we're all humans like all of us, and nobody is happier in government when things work. Nobody is going to be happier in the Ministry of Agriculture or Ministry of Environment when they see something really working. making Montserrat better, feeding the people. When you see that, it makes everyone happy. It's much better than, oh, here's another paper, here's another consultancy. There's a sort of slump that takes over in, another one.
Yes.
Where will that go, sort of thing. And you can say it when you get a little bit longer in the tooth, like me, towards the end of a public service career. We really need to move ourselves out of that dynamic into the one you've described. Thank you very much, everybody. Really good discussion, if I may say so. I thought you made a lot of really good points. Thank you.